let's go ahead now and dive into our very first major topic for today, which is on security frameworks. And we start the class overall talking about security frameworks because, well, I'm going to venture to guess that perhaps you guys, like me, over the years have realized that cybersecurity can be a little bit of a complex topic. And because it's a complex topic, it usually means that it is not so easy to explain cybersecurity to other non-security or other non-technology folks. This is related to something called the curse of knowledge. When you are extremely knowledgeable about a particular topic, you find it difficult, or anybody in any field finds it difficult to explain that topic to other people that aren't in that particular domain. Well, you would think that security frameworks would be able to provide you a way to more easily explain and more easily talk about security in ways that other folks can understand. Well, if you read all of the different PDFs for the myriad of different security frameworks that are available in the marketplace, that are available on the internet, you'll find a lot of times these security frameworks themselves can be a little bit confusing. Well, this is why in this module, I want to share with you a simple approach, right? A very simple approach for thinking about, for conceptualizing these different security frameworks. And we use the term framework kind of generically here in class to make our point. So a simple approach to think about security frameworks so that you can better, more easily conceptualize what you're doing in your overall security team. Now, this simple approach here, right, is really to divide up the different types of security frameworks that are available into three different buckets, three different categories. That is control frameworks, program frameworks, and risk frameworks. Now, before we get into all of these details here, I want to share with you an analogy to hopefully better, so that you can better relate to what we're talking about here. Let's pause for a moment. And let's pretend that I want to become a world-class chef. But unfortunately, I actually don't know all that much about cooking. I've got this aspiration, but I don't really know how to figure that out. So if I'm really just getting started cooking, well, one of the first things that I'm going to want to do is to make sure that I understand the potential ingredients that I can use. If we walk into the grocery store, a lot of times if I didn't know anything about cooking, I might be a little bit overwhelmed with all of the different things on the shelf. So the first thing that we need to do is come up with this list of ingredients, right? To figure out, well, what our ingredients might actually go well together. Hey, does basil go well with garlic? Does ginger go well with soy sauce? Things like that. So you've got your whole long list of ingredients, and that long list of ingredients are akin to your control frameworks. The control frameworks define, lay out, well, what are the potential ingredients that you could use to build your security team, to build your security program. Well, it's not enough to have a long list of ingredients. Certainly, if you go to the store and try to incorporate a bunch of different disparate ingredients, well, you're not going to have a very nice dish. This is where program frameworks come into play. If I'm just starting to learn about cooking, well, I might want to start with some cookbooks, some recipes that provide some best practices on how the dish should actually be assembled. And this is where program frameworks come into play. They provide a little bit of a cookbook, a little bit of a recipe that helps you define, well, what are some best practices that you can use to think about your security program, your meal, a little bit more comprehensively. And then finally, if I want to become a world-class chef, it's not just about making one delicious meal, one delicious dish. I need to think about the meal overall, what's the appetizer, what's the wine pairing, what's the drink pairing, what's the dessert, what are all of those different elements. But to be a world-class chef, well, I also want to have a world-class restaurant. So I've got to figure out, well, what is it that my diners want to pay for? What type of ambiance do they want? What type of decor do they want? What type of cuisine are they actually looking for? And this idea of figuring out, well, what other people want, what is the value, this is related to our risk frameworks. Because, well, we as the restaurateur, the world-class chef, we've got to figure out, well, what is it that the market actually wants? What is it that your stakeholders, your consumers, your diners actually want? And this is where the risk frameworks come in, because the risk framework, well, helps you prioritize, helps you identify, well, where is risk for the organization, and therefore, what are things that you can provide to mitigate, to manage some of that risk. So these frameworks are not mutually exclusive, right? As we're going to see at the end of this module, you don't just pick one, right? You're going to use probably multiple of them, but I have found, generally speaking, that as your security program matures, right, you will use more and more of these frameworks over time. So let's go ahead and talk about some of these frameworks, starting with control frameworks first. So the question becomes, when do you use a control framework? Now, you use a control framework if you are just starting out to identify a baseline set of controls. I've got a good friend who turns out that he moved over to lead the security program at this one relatively young organization. And it was a startup, but they had kind of grown to be a pretty big size. But since they're a technology company, he showed up and he realized that, hey, they didn't really have a set way of looking at all of the security things that they were implementing. And because they weren't thinking about it holistically, he said, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and start, because it's a very technically oriented organization, go ahead and start by using a control framework to better talk about the set of controls that we have in place and where we actually need to make progress. So he used it to, assess the state of their current technical capabilities, but also prioritize what should actually be done next. So this is a good way to create an initial, I would say more technical roadmap for your security team. So these are the control frameworks. So let's take a look at some examples. First, we've got Nist, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. SP stands for Special Publication 853. Now, side note, the Nist 800 series, right, is a set of different standards associated with information security, 853 being one of the most well-known ones, and was created originally to be a comprehensive control catalog. Every potential control that you can implement in your organization. The intent is to define it within NIST 853 here. Now, there are different versions of this, version 4, Rev 4, Rev 5, and so on, that just recently came out. But the common theme here is that you've got 18 different categories, as you see here, that define, well, what are the controls that could potentially be implemented. You've got things like access control. You've got things like security assessment, configuration management, risk assessment, program management, and so on. So a number of controls that you can implement. Now, will you ever implement all of the 853 controls in your organization? No, definitely not. That would be like trying to create a dish with all of the potential ingredients that you see at the supermarket. Based on your organizational requirements, your business requirements, you're going to implement a subset of these controls. Now, related to that, let's talk about 853 a little bit more, right? This comprehensive control catalog, this comprehensive list of different ingredients that you could utilize are broken up into different families, different controls, and different control enhancements. We will see this on the next slide. But I just said that you can't implement all 853 controls in your organization. Well, what's a starting point then on what to actually implement? 853 in associated documentation defines, well, different priorities. Certain controls have different priorities associated with them that based on priority 1, 2, 3, right, you might implement some of those first. Also, depending on your security control baseline that your organization might have defined, right, if you're in a low impact, moderate, or high impact environment, you're going to implement a different subset of controls. Here, on this slide, let's take a look at an example. If we just zoom into the access control family here, you've got different control numbers as you see in the first column, AC1, 2, all the way up to 11 in this example. You've got the corresponding control names. But check this out. You've got the priority associated with some of these control families, But depending on whether or not you're in a low, moderate, or high impact environment, certain subsets, certain number of these controls would be recommended for implementation based on your initial control baseline here. Now, one last thing on this slide that we've highlighted in the lower right-hand corner is your control enhancement. Well, what does that mean? You can see here that this is part of AC11, device lock. I think we're all familiar with this, right? You've got your computer, it's configured to auto lock after a certain amount of inactivity. You've got your mobile device that is configured to auto lock after a certain amount of inactivity. Well, this control enhancement basically says that, hey, in certain situations, like on your mobile device, the mobile operating system that can automatically take a screenshot of what you were looking at before the device locks, so that when you come back and open up the device again, well, it can show you that screenshot to make you feel like the performance is faster than actually reloading the app itself. Here, this control enhancement points out that, hey, if you got some sensitive data on that app open at that time, like maybe financial information, well, you might not want that saved and persisted as a screenshot on the device itself. So this really points out that in those cases, you would want to go ahead and wipe out, right? Wipe out the contents of that screenshot and configure your app so that the application does not do that, so that it inadvertently stores that sensitive information in a location on the operating system itself. So that's our access control example here. So that was a high-level overview of Nist 853. Kind of, I would say, maybe the granddaddy of control frameworks, because it is intended to be comprehensive. Well, now the question comes up is, okay, well, how can we refine this a little bit more? How can we start to look at the controls that are going to be a little bit more impactful in mitigating known issues in our environment? And this is where we get to the CIS controls, the top 20, as it's previously been called, Critical Security Controls, or CSC. Now, as you can see here, it defines 20 different control categories: basic, foundational, and organizational. Now, quick side note here. Does anybody here know Tony Sager? Right, Tony Sager used to head up the security team, was the CIO at the NSA, in the Information Assurance Directorate. And during his long tenure at the NSA, one of the things that he worked on was, well, leading the red team. And as you can imagine, the red team would go around and assess, pen test different environments, different systems in the environment. And they would invariably find a bunch of vulnerabilities and issues. And they would share this with the blue team. Well, after some period of time, the leader of the blue team said, hey, Tony, this is great that your team keeps finding all of this stuff, but you guys find this stuff and then give it to us and leave, and you don't tell us what we can do to actually mitigate or prevent these issues from occurring in the future. So Tony said, yeah, you're right. So he said, we're going to start by having a meeting with the blue team and the red team where we're going to brainstorm together. What are the most successful attacks, and what are maybe, let's say, the defenses that we could put in place to mitigate, let's say, 80% of those common attacks that we are using. And that became originally known as the Consensus Audit Guidelines, that eventually became the SANS Critical Security Controls. Now those critical security controls are shepherded by and overseen by CIS, the Center for Internet Security, right, who are now the stewards of what are currently called the CIS controls. So these top 20, and a quick side note, it's not really just 20, right? It is actually, last I counted, something like 130 or 140 sub-controls, but you've got these different 20 control categories that define, not only based on government and agency input, but also over the years, enterprise input as well, what are the most common defenses that mitigate the most common attacks, right, that you are seeing out there in the wild. So that is the Critical Security Controls, the CIS controls. Now, the CIS controls have been used successfully over the years in a number of different organizations, right? The U.S. Department of State said, hey, we reduced risk by 90% in year number 1. The Australian Signals Directorate, right, which is the equivalent of the NSA in Australia, they've got their equivalent version of the critical controls called the top 35, and they say that, hey, we've stopped 85% of known intrusions in our SOC by implementing these various capabilities. The Federal Reserve has used this successfully as well. Now, Russell Eubanks, a friend, fellow SANS instructor, right, he also published a white paper, the link is in the notes to this page, called A Small Business No Budget Implementation of the Critical Controls as well. So you don't have to be a huge organization to implement these controls, right? You can start chipping away at these controls in an organization of any size using tools and capabilities that you might already have in-house as well. So what are some other resources for moving forward, getting started with these different control frameworks? Now, James and Kelly Tarala, who are the authors of our Critical Security Controls course here at SANS, well, they've published some free resources on their website, auditscripts.com. They've published a control master mapping. Now, this is pretty cool. It is a spreadsheet that maps the CIS controls to other frameworks like 853, other compliance regimes like PCI, HIPAA, and so on. So depending on what your organizational requirements are, you can go ahead and use this master mapping spreadsheet to figure out, well, what needs to be mapped to each other in your organization. They also have published a control manual assessment tool. Now, this is also a spreadsheet available on this website, and this really lets you go ahead and define, hey, for each of the 20 controls, how are we doing? How much progress are we actually making? Now, CIS, the Center for Internet Security, right, the stewards of the controls now, they've taken the concepts that James and Kelly put together in this spreadsheet, and they've created a corresponding web application for it as well. Now, they also have this separate implementation guide that is a useful reference resource to check out. But let me go ahead and show you guys what this web application looks like. Now, switching over here to my browser here, you can see that I'm logged in at the CIS website to this tool, which is at the top here, csat, right, .cisecurity.org. Now, this is free. If you just register, you can go ahead and play around with this for free. But you can see that they've defined all of the top 20 controls up here at the top. And since this is just a little test account that I have, there's not really much data in it. But if I go ahead and click into the first one, control number 1, for example, and let me make this a little bit bigger for you guys. If I go ahead and click into this, you can see that we've got the various sub-controls that are defined here as well. And control number 1 and 2 are all about asset inventory. If I just go ahead and click on one of these, let's say 1.4, you can see that this tool allows us to say, this is a simple assessment tool. Do we have policy defined for this particular control? And do we have approved written policy? I'm just going to say yes. Is the control actually implemented? Well, there's parts of it that are implemented, or it's implemented on some systems. I'm just going to say here for illustration purposes that it's implemented on all systems. Oh, by the way, is the control automated? Well, it's automated on some or most. Again, I'm just going to say it's automated on all systems here. And do we have corresponding reporting on the control? I'm going to say it's reported on all systems. And then I'm going to say complete here, right, without corresponding evidence. And once I do that, right, it is going to come back and it will show some marginal improvement in my overall control progress, right? You can see that this line slowly trends up over time, and you can see that this control implementation average has changed down here at the bottom. So again, just highlighting the fact that, hey, we've got a simple tool that is freely available for your use, for your reference, if you want to check it out. Now, this is an example, right, of the spreadsheet version of the assessment tool that we just showed you. And I use this screenshot here because it's a little bit easier to put into slide form. You can see, all of the progress for all of the different controls on one slide, whereas the web app that we just looked at, you kind of have to move around and click around a little bit. But you've got a nice little dashboard here in terms of this overall progress that you're making in the CIS controls. So this brings us now to program frameworks. Now remember, program framework is a little bit of your recipe. It's kind of like your cookbook. right? It says, hey, what should you be doing? How should you put this dish? How should you put this meal together a little bit more comprehensively? It's not just about implementing a bunch of controls. You also want to make sure that you build a comprehensive security program so that you can go ahead and measure not just your progress on implementing those controls, but your maturity overall, and you can use this to compare yourselves to others, right? I once had a meeting with my CFO. I tell this story all the time because, you know, I scheduled this meeting with her to, in my mind, was to get her buy-in for increasing the budget for the security program, getting her buy-in for the overall security business case that we were going to be presenting down the road. And apparently, you know, it was easy to read, right? She stopped me about 5 minutes into the meeting, and she said, Frank, we get it. In finance, we understand cybersecurity is important. But what we want to know is, are we spending too much? Are we spending too little? Are we doing more than our industry peers? She was asking this question right here, right? How do we compare to our competitors? Are we doing too much or are we doing too little? So this is one way that we can simplify communications with non-technology leaders, with our business leaders, because we can talk about our security program in the form of comparisons, but we can also talk about our security program in the form of industry-recognized frameworks, right? So let's go ahead and talk about some of these different program frameworks. We're going to talk about a couple different program frameworks, and the first one that we're going to mention here is ISO, the Organization of International Standardization. They are 27,000 series. Now, they publish many different standards and frameworks for different areas. The 27,000 series is the information security related standards. Now, this is a little bit of an overview. You can see that here on the slide that they've got different standards for different topics. 27001 defines the high-level ISMS. This is their fancy way of saying your information security program, their information security management system that defines the high-level requirements. But also, they've got 27002. This defines your implementation guidance. And this is defines more specifically, well, what are the controls that need to actually be implemented? Now, there are other ones here, and there are some sector-specific ones, like for cloud, for PII, for the energy sector, and so on. But this is a high-level overview of the different standards that make up overall ISO 27000 series. So on this slide, let's zoom in a little bit more. Right? So if we take a look at the primary standard, which is 27001, that defines your ISMS requirements, well, you can see that it defines different areas of focus for building your security program. Now, it defines a number of different things. Not only, you can see, just look at this list, glance at this list. What is the primary difference of the topics that are listed here in these areas of focus compared to the topics that were listed in the control frameworks that we just looked at, right? And the primary difference is that, hey, the control frameworks are much more technical. You can see here, organizational context. Well, what does this mean? Factoring in your business objectives, your organization's strategic objectives, making sure that you understand and you build out your strategic planning capabilities to tie back to those business requirements. Leadership, in terms of defining your appropriate roles and responsibilities, corresponding planning, support, what capabilities need to exist in the organization to make sure that you can operationalize these different security capabilities, to make sure that it is documented, making sure that you measure progress and have continuous improvement. So just as a glance, you can see that, hey, the program framework is not just talking about the list of technical ingredients, it's talking about, hey, what needs to be in place to make sure that these ingredients become a tasty meal. But 27001 also goes on to define different control objectives here, right? And looking at this, you can see that it's a mixture of technical items like access control, cryptography, physical security, right? Communication security, incident response, but there's also a number of governance-related topics here, like information security policies, which we'll talk about later on, organization of security, what's your roles and responsibilities, HR, onboarding, offboarding security, supplier relationships, and so on. So there's a number of things here, and the main delineation here is that, yes, the program frameworks talk beyond, right, beyond the technical capabilities that we are so used to implementing. Let me ask you guys here, who uses 27001 in your organizations? I find that it is a smaller percentage in North America, right? It is maybe 15, maybe 20%, up to 25% of organizations. People say that they do use 27000 series in their organizations. Now, I will say that it is a smaller percentage, I believe, for a couple of different reasons. One, 27000 is a little bit more of a rigorous framework. If you are starting relatively early, if you're close to ground zero, you probably don't want to start with 27000, right? Because it takes a while to actually ramp up, right? And so I was part of an organization once a number of years ago. This was in the 2012 timeframe. And we found that we needed to use some framework to better structure our security activities. And we looked around and we said, of course, well, there's 27000. Well, should we use it? And we decided at the time that it was a little bit too much for us, where our maturity was at in terms of the security program. And we had no business driver to specifically use 27001, right? So we kind of made up our own framework at the time, which I'll mention here a little bit later as well. So we made it up and it was very successful. People internally loved it. They said, we finally understand what you're talking about from a security perspective. Well, other organizations, right, that 20-25% of people, well, I say that they use it because they do have a business requirement. Every major cloud provider is 27001 certified. And that's because, well, the major all the cloud providers have customers around the world. And they want to show to their customers around the world that they meet the highest level of assurance, right? This more rigorous framework, this more rigorous standard. But also, around the world, that's a key point, is people outside of North America, right? ISO tends to be adopted a little bit more. When I go to Europe, for example, I find that there's a higher percentage of people adopting 27001 because, one, it is an international standard, and they want to make sure that they don't seem to be preferring, right, standards like Nist that is seen to be more US-centric. Now, that is changing. That is changing over time, as we're going to talk about. But this is one reason why I think so few of you are using 27001. So this brings us to our next program framework. Now, this is the Nist CSF, the Cybersecurity Framework. Now, how often do these items in these frameworks undergo review and change? So far, let's take a couple examples here. First, we talked about Nist 853. Now, it was the last main version was Rev 4. Rev 5 just was finalized. And so as you can see that over the years, right, you've gotten to 4 or 5 different revisions. So every number of years, 853 does get refreshed, right? Now, I lose track of time here. Maybe some of you can remind me. Getting from Rev 4 to Rev 5 and the official version of Rev 5 took many years. The CIS controls have point updates on a regular basis and have major updates depending at least every couple of years or so. The Nist Cybersecurity Framework actually has its roots in 2013. Now, when then President Barack Obama issued an executive order saying that, hey, we, the United States as a country, need to do more to improve the cybersecurity of our critical infrastructure. Well, as a result of that executive order, one part of it was to create an industry standard, industry recognized framework. And that became the CSF, the Cybersecurity Framework, which when it was first created was voluntary. So that work started in about 2013. If I remember correctly, it was officially published, the first version, in 2014. And Summer, to your question, there's been, I think, 2 different revisions of the CSF since that time as well. Now, since the CSF first came out in 2014 timeframe, right, it has seen huge adoption. more and more people have been using it across different organizations and across different industries. I think one reason for that was, one, it was originally said it was voluntary, so people themselves willingly signed up. But number two, I think another big reason for its adoption was that it is very simple. Right? If you take a look at this, if you read the CSF document, which the main part of the document is only about 15 pages long, highly recommend everybody reading that if you haven't read it already. The framework is divided into three parts: core, implementation tiers, and profiles. Now the core is very simple. All it is these 5 boxes, these 5 functions we see on the left-hand side of this slide. And this very simply, right, defines the life cycle that all of our security teams actually go through. We need to identify, right, our requirements, identify our assets, identify what we need to do. Right? Then we need to prevent bad things from happening. If something gets by our protective capabilities, we need to detect it. Once we detect those things, we need to respond, and then we need to recover. Wow, that's it. Very simple. I have found that using this simple model, it makes it a lot easier to communicate with non-security and non-technical people about what it is the security team is doing. Right? Now, I mentioned that in a prior life, we had created our own framework. Now, it was actually, before the CSF came out, and it was actually very similar. Not exactly the same, but very similar to the CSF. And as I mentioned, people loved it. It helped us communicate a lot better. People understood what we were doing. Well, fast forward a few years later, the CSF started to get a bit more market share, a little bit more mind share. So then we had people, others in the organization, ask us, well, hey, we understand your framework, but why aren't you using an industry-recognized framework like the CSF? And so we had to switch, right? We had to switch from using our homegrown framework to the cybersecurity framework because it was industry-recognized. And lots of senior leaders. There is a side note here. There is an organization. Has anybody heard of an organization called the NACD, National Association of Corporate Directors? Now, there are like institutions like the NACD here in North America, around the world, the IOD, Institute of Directors in the UK, and so on. Well, NACD, as the name implies, is an organization that provides guidance to boards of directors on nominating and governance, on compensation, on social awareness issues, on finance, and so on. Well, they also provide guidance to boards of directors on cybersecurity. And as part of this guidance, they publish a document, Effective Cyber Risk Oversight, for you as a board member. Well, one of the things that they recommend to board members is to ask. They say, you as a board member, ask your security leaders, are you using an industry-recognized framework? And they say, they don't specify which framework, but they say, like ISO 27001 or like Nist CSF. So the awareness, even at senior-most levels, of the fact that CSF exists has been on the rise, right? So lots of organizations adopting CSF, because also partly because if you're a board member at one organization, you have other board member friends, other executive buddies, you might talk about this. They say, what framework are you using? And they're going to compare notes, right? They want to see if we're following industry best practices. All right, so let's go ahead and zoom in here to the next level of detail. If you've got the high-level functions, you also have the different categories. Now, from a category perspective, you can see just by glancing at this list, you can see that the identify function focuses more on, right, the governance type of activities, asset inventory, governance, risk management, and so on. But the protect function has other capabilities that we are very familiar with, I'm sure. Identity and access management, data protection, protective technologies like on the network, on the endpoint, and so on. So these high-level functions are divided into different categories. Now, let's go ahead and zoom into just one area here. Let's say the protect function. Now, in terms of these other categories, now I just mentioned that one of the reasons people, I think that NIST CSF has seen such huge adoption is that it is very simple. We can easily describe what we do to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Well, there's an organization called Praxion, and the link is in the notes to this page. What they do is they go around and they take highly complex technical standards and they translate that into plain language. And you can see what they've done here is that, hey, for each of the functions, they've made it a little bit more explicit what that means, and they've translated these different categories into this plain language over here on the right-hand side. Now, I think it was already pretty straightforward, pretty simple enough, but you can see here that they've made it even more explicit when you are talking to non-technical folks, right? You might want to keep this stuff in mind, is what is it that we're actually doing in each of these areas, right? And it says, hey, what's the so what? What's the main point? We are protecting assets, detecting anomalies, things like that. So now, if we go ahead and zoom in to just the protect function, again, you've got the different categories. Oh, but hey, the CSF, the framework itself, also defines various subcategories, as we see here in this third column. Now, this is really important. It also defines various informative references here. Now, we already mentioned 853, so it defines, hey, which 853 controls are associated with each of these subcategories, categories, and high-level functions. Same thing for the CSC, the CIS controls, the critical security controls. Those are mapped here as well. Now, for us as security leaders, this is one of the key things that we want to have in place, is that we want to make sure that we understand this mapping, because I'm going to venture to guess that everybody here in class, your teams have all implemented some number of controls. And by identifying what those controls are per the standard control framework, then you can map it back here to these different categories and high-level functions to tell the higher-level story. Now, so far we've talked about program frameworks and control frameworks. Now, on this slide, just for illustration purposes, I've gone ahead and mapped the different CIS controls to the different categories and functions in the CSF. Now, just by glancing at this, you can see that we've got some blank spots. And the blank spots are primarily here in the identify area. You can see that CIS controls, your control framework, doesn't really talk about anything related to business environment or governance or risk management or even your supply chain security, right? Your vendor risk management. So this is really just highlighting the fact that, hey, this is why we can't rely on just a control framework alone, because it won't necessarily give us a comprehensive view of what we need in our overall security program. You need to also make sure that you marry it, map it to your program framework, like the Nist CSF. From a mapping perspective, right, we already talked about, right, how they can be used together. Now, these are not mutually exclusive, and this mapping, whether it be with the audit scripts master mapping that I mentioned earlier, that spreadsheet tool, or Nist also has a CSF mapping here that maps to these different items and more. So this is, again, a key activity that we are going to need to undertake as a security leader in terms of structuring our overall security program. Now, the reason that we do this here is because, well, we want to be able to tell a story. And here, in this example, we've got the Nist CSF functions on the left-hand side on the y-axis, and we've got different maturity levels on the x-axis, 1 to 5. And this is really in one simple slide showing, well, where are we today in terms of the current state? Where do we want to get to in the future? And oh, remember this line here, how do we compare to our industry peers? Now, if you don't have some sort of slide like this on your team, right, I'm going to say that you have to have something like this, right? You got to go back and start to put this together, because a slide like this has saved my bacon many times, right? Because it, in one illustration, conveys that, one, you've done a lot of homework here to figure out what's your current state, what's your future state, and who are we actually comparing ourselves against. So that was our program frameworks here. So this brings us to our last topic in this module, which is the corresponding risk frameworks. Now, the risk frameworks do a couple of different things for us. They, one, allow you to define a common risk assessment and common risk management process. So that's very useful in terms of having a little bit more of a rigorous process in your organization. But for us, we also want to think about it in terms of, okay, going back to our chef analogy here, opening up a world-class restaurant, what is it that customers want? What's the ambiance? What's the vibe? What's the decor, right? What's the cuisine that they actually want? Similarly, we've got to understand what it is our business stakeholders want in the organization. And to do that, we can use risk frameworks to help better analyze the risk and prioritize our various security activities. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at a number of different risk-related frameworks here. Now, Nist, of course, also has a number of security risk standards. Now, I will say, if any of you guys have read these Nist standards and these corresponding PDFs, there's three primary ones that are associated with information security risk-related matters. There's 839, 837, and 830. Now, when you go read these documents, I will say it's a little complex, right? It's a little complex to decipher these documents a little bit in this particular case. At a high level, what these documents are talking about is, well, what is the overall risk management process that is defined in this diagram? You need to assess risk, and when you find risk, you need to respond to that risk, and you need to monitor your environment to make sure, right, that you are responding appropriately and continuously assessing. So we've got this kind of never-ending cycle here. But in the middle, we've got what NIST calls the frame, right? This is the framing, kind of the business context, the organizational context. What are your strategic objectives, your business goals, what's your current state, what are your different capabilities? So that's your framing associated with it. And it's really 839 that defines this overall risk management process, and then 837 that if you happen to be in an environment where you've got federal information systems, 837 defines the RMF, the risk management framework. That is basically the same as the overall risk management process in 839, but specifically with specifics for federal information systems. Now, 830 is a document that only talks about the assessment process up here at the top. So this is kind of how they all fit together. So if we zoom in a little bit here in terms of risk assessment, the stuff that is defined in 830, you can see that, hey, step number 1 to 4, prepare for the assessment, that understanding that organizational framing that we were talking about. And then step number 2, well, which is the bulk of it, conducting the assessment itself. Identifying the threat sources, your vulnerabilities, what's the likelihood, what's the impact to measure risk, right? This is your high-level process overall, which the document goes into a lot more detail about. Once you've assessed the risk, you've of course got to communicate it, and then you've got to maintain the results. Now, in terms of the structure of this diagram, if you could think about, just kind of imprint these 4 different boxes and their rough positioning in your mind, because we're going to see a similar diagram here coming up momentarily that I want you to mentally compare this diagram to the diagram that we're going to see here just in a little bit. Now, side note here, we also have the RMF that I mentioned, the Risk Management Framework. Now, the reason that I highlight this here is that while you might, if you're not in this type of environment that has to do this work for a federal information system, well, you might need to, you don't have to follow these steps as specifically as is laid out in the RMF. But I highlight it here because it's useful to take a step back and think, well, what's the overall process? What's the overall life cycle? Where are we in the overall risk management process? Are we categorizing, right, related to asset inventory? Are we step 2? Are we at the point of selecting controls? Are we at step 3, implementing those controls, assessing how well they're doing? And this is also a specific step, authorizing that system, right, for use, and then continuing to monitor those various security controls. So the overall RMF process, as illustrated here, can conceptually be used in other scenarios as well. Now remember I said to imprint that diagram here from a prior slide? Now go ahead and mentally, if you could, compare that diagram to this diagram. Very similar to what we saw before, but this is ISO 27005. Now 27005 is the security risk management standard from ISO, and you'll notice that the diagrams are very similar, but there are a couple different boxes here, right? Anybody, can you glance? It is risk treatment and risk acceptance. Those were the two boxes that weren't on the prior slide. Well, why? Don't we need those? Isn't that a comprehensive thing to include? Why weren't they on the prior diagram? Well, remember, the prior diagram was from NIST 830. That was only the risk assessment process. 27005 here is your overall security risk management process, which defines the overall process, not just the risk assessment process here. Because it's the overall risk management process, well, you've also got to include things like, hey, how are you going to treat the risk? How are you going to accept the risk? And so on. So this now brings us to another framework, another model called FAIR. Now, FAIR stands for Factor Analysis of Information Risk. We only have a couple slides here on FAIR, and we want to mention it here because, well, I'm going to venture to guess that the vast majority of us, right, the way that we do risk assessments today is based on qualitative measures like low, medium, and high, red, yellow, green, 1, 2, 3, and so on, right? Now, I mentioned FAIR here because FAIR is a quantitative framework, quantitative standard. Now, they call it an ontology, actually, if you look at the details of it, but this standard provides a common approach for talking about risk in quantitative terms, in terms of, well, usually dollars and cents, money that might be lost if something happens. Now, this is an international standard that is slowly gaining more and more adoption as the years progress. FAIR is an open standard promoted by the FAIR Institute, and the standards themselves are published by the Open Group. Now, here we talk about the FAIR model because at a high level, well, FAIR is giving us some common vocabulary, common structure to think about risk. Now, we're going to talk more about risk here as we progress in class, but at a high level, risk is really composed of two things. Number one is what's your impact, what FAIR calls the loss magnitude, and what's your likelihood, your loss event frequency. Now remember, risk is impact, how bad could it be? Likelihood, how likely is it that that event is going to occur? Now I'm purposely mangling the terms here a little bit. I think that the FAIR purists would maybe be would warn me about using these terms interchangeably, but I'm using them here for conversational purposes, right? Conceptually, we're talking about the same thing here, but they've specifically chosen words like loss magnitude and loss event frequency to more explicitly refer to the ways that you can quantify these different events. But at a high level, as we're going to see later, FAIR also defines this loss event frequency, this likelihood, if you will, as being comprised of your threat event frequency, and also your vulnerability. Now, we'll talk more about vulnerabilities and vulnerability management later on in the course, and I think when we think vulnerability, we are referring to like a vulnerability in Windows or Linux and so on. That is not what FAIR is talking about when they refer to vulnerability. It's a little bit different here, but you get the concepts, right? You get the high-level concepts are similar here in terms of FAIR and how we are qualitatively assessing risk today as well. So we talk about those risk control frameworks, program frameworks, and risk frameworks because it gives us a sense of, well, what we need to do in our organizations overall. Now, separate from the frameworks, or sometimes in addition to the frameworks themselves, we talked about those because we want to use them to structure our work, structure our activities, make it easier for us to communicate what security is actually doing. Separate from that, we also sometimes need third-party validation, these third-party certification that we are in fact doing the right thing from a security perspective. Now, there are a few different ways that you can do this. Your organization, can go ahead and get a SOC 2 Type 2. right? And by getting a third-party auditing firm to come in and do this SOC 2 Type 2 assessment, right, you'll get a report that is based on a number of different trust principles that you select, like privacy, security, availability, and so on, that then you can give to your customers to show that, yes, we are meeting this minimum set of requirements as attested to by this third party. Similarly, ISO 27001 is not only a useful framework that we can use to structure our activities, but you can also have a third party come in and do an ISO 27001 assessment and certify that your organization, your project, your application, whatever the scope might be, right, is 27001 certified. And you can give that certification to third parties to prove to them that, yes, they should trust you and they should be okay doing business with you. FedRAMP, right? If you are working in the federal government space, right, you might require that certain technology products, be FedRAMP certified. So that's another one here that you'd have to meet certain requirements. Now, in terms of a really good question, we just talked about risk frameworks, one of them being FAIR. Are there any cases where FAIR has been implemented successfully? Now, we will see one example, at least in a case study, coming up later on in class. So there are a number of organizations that have started to use FAIR successfully. Financial institutions, healthcare institutions, retail institutions, and so on. Now, I will say that when you are using FAIR, it is hard to get started. You don't want to just jump right in and say, hey, we're switching everything over to FAIR. Example, I once worked at an organization with a colleague, a friend of mine, and he was a quantitative analysis evangelist. He said, hey, the way that we are doing risk assessments today, doing low, medium, and high, hey, we could do better. And I agreed with him. So internally to the team, we started using different quantitative approaches like FAIR to better measure and analyze risk. So it was good. We just started to use it slowly, and that's usually what it takes, honestly, over the course of probably a number of years. Well, he was on a little bit of a crusade. He went to the central enterprise risk management team, and I think you can all guess how they were assessing risk, right? Central ERM team was assessing risk in qualitative form, low, medium, and high. Well, he went to them, and essentially the message that came across was, hey, you guys are doing it the wrong way. You should be using these quantitative approaches because they're more rigorous, give you better information, let you analyze more effectively, and so on. Well, what did the ERM team say to him? Yeah, the ERM team, as you can imagine, said, well, take a hike, get out of here. What we're doing is fine. So you've got to take a slow and steady approach to start to incorporate some of these different elements. Now, we've got an upcoming lab later on today about calibration. Now, calibration is related to thinking about your skills, your analysis skills, in a little bit more of a rigorous fashion, right? But Mia, there are a number of organizations that have used FAIR, have been using FAIR, but it is increasing adoption here, definitely. So we talk about these different security frameworks because as you mature your program, right, what you want to do is you want to use at least one, and probably more, depending on your requirements, frameworks from each category, right? So your control frameworks help you define what is the baseline set of security controls that you want to use. Your program frameworks let you structure that a lot in a way that you can communicate a lot better. So like when you've got a restaurant, you're not going to tell people, right, just a list of 50 ingredients that went into the dish. What you're going to say is that this is the corresponding dish, and these are the different courses, and so on. So it helps to simplify communications with the business. And then the risk frameworks are going to be used to prioritize your different activities, going through your risk assessment process, your risk analysis process, to identify where there's risk, what controls can mitigate those, so that then you can start to prioritize what you should actually do first. All right, everybody, this brings us now to our Cyber 42 game, our security leadership simulation. This is kind of like a continuous tabletop exercise where you are presented with different events, and you've got to respond to these different events as the class progresses. Kind of think about it like a board game that you might be playing with your family at home, with your friends, And when you play this board game, well, you've got to do a little bit of setup. You've got to understand the game rules. And so in this next set of slides, that's what we're going to do, is we're going to explain to you how the game works a little bit so that you can we make sure that you effectively play the game. So what is Cyber 42? Well, as we said, it's a leadership simulation game, putting you in real-life type of situations. Now, you're going to go ahead and choose different actions, right, in response to the events that are going to be presented. If you've ever read one of those choose-your-own-adventure books as a kid, you're presented with a different series of events, and then you can decide, do I want to choose option A, B, C, or D, and so on. And that's exactly what this game is structured to be like. Now, some of these options that you choose are going to have uncertain outcomes. You might choose an option because you think, well, that's a good trade-off. It doesn't cost that much, and let's go ahead and choose it. But you will see in the debrief that, hey, there was some unexpected outcome that was the result of that. Just like in real life, we try to do things that are going to improve security, improve our relationships, improve our security program, but sometimes the actions that we choose to take have unintended consequences. And you will find that that's probably the case with the game here as well. Now, because you are taking this course in on-demand, you are going to go ahead and play on your own as an individual. As part of the on-demand class, you will receive a link to the online Cyber 42 web application. And this web application is where you're going to be playing the game overall. Now the question becomes, well, how do you play the game? How do you win the game? Well, just like with any board game, well, in this particular case, the person or the team with the highest security culture score wins the game. Now, it's not just about implementing various technical security capabilities. This is why we call it the security culture score. We want to have a sense of, hey, how well have you embedded security into the fabric of your organization? Now, certainly, at the same time, you're going to be improving your various security capabilities, as is represented by these dials, these gauges, down here at the bottom of the slide. The identify, protect, detect, and respond capabilities. Now, just like in the real world, when you are leading your security team at work, you've got limited resources. You've got limited time. You've got to do things on a schedule. You've got a deadline. You also have limited budget to spend on these various capabilities. Similarly, in the Cyber 42 game, well, you've got a certain amount of time. You've got 40 time units that you're going to start with, and you've got a $5 million budget that you start with. And oh, by the way, it's not like there's been no security in your organization. Your starting security culture score is 55. Hey, that's not too great. Hopefully that you can only go up from here. But we wanted to start you off with some appropriate values. And so you can see the gauges, the dials at the bottom are all starting at 0. So you need to mature your security capabilities as well. But ultimately, the way that you win the game is the team with the highest security culture score wins. Now, because you're playing the game in on-demand, you will be playing against other on-demand students. And you will see when you log into the web app, there is a scoreboard that you could view. And the scoreboard will show, well, your progress, your score, and you could then compare yourself to how other students are doing as well as you progress in the game throughout the class. So the game scoring, how does it work? As you move forward in the class, the game is played in 3 different rounds. Now, there are 4 different events per round. These events are these unexpected events that are going to occur that you need to deal with, that you need to respond to. Based on how you respond to these events, it's going to cost you perhaps a certain amount of money and a certain amount of time. But if your response is good, well, it's going to lead to you improving your security capabilities and ultimately lead to an increase in your security culture score. But we mentioned these rounds as kind of a demarcation point here, because at the end of the round, the web app is automatically going to do some scoring adjustments for you. Now, for every $250,000 you spent beyond your budget, right? Just like in the real world, if you blow your budget, if you spend too much money, well, that's going to result in potentially a negative perception of you, your capabilities as a leader, and your security team. So if you spend every $250K, you spend beyond your budget, at the end of each round, you're going to lose 1 culture point. Similarly, if you don't manage your projects effectively, you miss your deadlines, well then that impacts your credibility as well. So every time unit spent beyond your plan, you're going to lose 1 security culture point as well. But it's not just about losing culture points. You can also gain culture points by improving your security capabilities, those gauges, those dials we saw on the prior slide. Well, for every point integer, every point greater than 3, for each security capability, you're going to increase. Your security culture score is going to increase by 2 points. Now remember, these scoring adjustments happen at the end of every round. So after the first round, there's not going to be really any adjustment because it's not possible for you to have blown your budget and spent all of your time by the end of round number 1. But we just want to tell you about this up front because at the end of the subsequent rounds, some of this could come into play here. Now, this is very important, right? I'm going to warn you now, there's a little bit of logistics that you've got to do to make sure that you're set up and in the web application correctly. So the first thing, right, as an on-demand student, you're going to get access to that link. But you're also going to get access to the basic authentication credentials to access the game overall. So that is step number 1. Using the link that is provided to you as part of your on-demand access and the corresponding basic auth credentials, in step number 1, you're going to go ahead and log in, connect to the application itself. Once you connect in, you're going to see that there is a menu bar at the top, and there's going to be a little registration tab. You're going to go ahead and click the Register tab, and this is where you need to create your own personal user ID and password. Now, just a suggestion, right? Maybe put your first name in the username to more easily identify yourself, but you got to self-register your own account, all right? Then, step number 3, you've got to create your own team. Now, this tab here says Create or Join Team. Right, because you're playing in on demand on your own, you're going to have to create your own team. Now, this is going to be a team of 1. You're going to be the only member of that team. This is just an artifact of the way that the game is set up, where you have to play in a team, but you're going to be playing in a team of 1, a team of yourself. You're going to go ahead and click this Create or Join Team button. Now, before I go to the next slide, just want to recap this. Right, this is where it could potentially be a little bit confusing. There are 3 different passwords, right? 3 different things that you're going to need to do, 3 different accounts that you need to log in with. Number 1 is the basic authentication credentials, user ID and password that we, SANS, are going to be providing to you as part of your on-demand access. Then number 2, you need to go ahead and register, create your own user ID and password. Don't lose this, right? Because there's no way to recover it. Make sure you keep this in a safe place that you remember what it is. And then once you do that, then step number 3, you're going to go ahead and create your own team. Now, because you're playing on your own, a team of yourself, I would maybe suggest that you use the same password for the team that you used for the username in step number 2. But 3 things that you need to do to gain access to the web app itself. So after you're done with step 3, you click Create or Join Team. Then you're going to be presented with this screen. Now you'll see here that there are 2 parts of this screen. There is the Join Team portion and there's the Create Team portion. Because you're playing on your own in on demand, well, you only have to worry about the Create Team functionality down here at the bottom. Now you're going to choose your own team name. It's case sensitive. Watch out for this. You want to make sure you remember your team name and create the corresponding password. And then this is what's going to allow you then to get access to the game overall and then start to play the game as your own team. All right? So that was a little bit of the Cyber 42 setup. Right? So now you should be getting close to the point where you are ready to play the game. Now, quick warning. Before you play the game, right? Note that once you make a selection, anyone on your team, now in this case it's a team of just yourself, right? Once you make that selection and you click the confirm dialog that pops up, well, your selection is final, right? There is no way to reverse that selection. So make sure that you read the scenarios ahead of time, right? Before you make the selection and progress in the game itself, right? The choices cannot be reversed. So just a quick word of warning. Make sure that you know that that's the answer that you want to choose before finalizing your selection. So that brings us to our very first activity in Cyber 42, and that is initiative selection. Now, in the notes to your book, in the notes to your course book, we have written out the 6 different initiatives that you can select from. So just like in the real world, right, at work, you probably have some longer running projects, some longer running initiatives that you have decided to work on. Right? And these are things that you think that over time are going to improve your security program overall. For every single round in the game, you are going to be choosing one initiative. So that means by the end of the class, you will have the opportunity to select 3 different initiatives. Now we've got 6 defined for you here in the book, also in the web app that you will see momentarily. Now that you've got these 6, remember, you're going to choose up to 3 by the end of the week. But right now, you are only going to choose 1. All right? You're going to read about all of the 6 different initiatives, and you're going to go ahead and choose one of them. All right? Now, before you start, I'm going to switch over to the web app and give you a little bit of orientation on what you're going to be seeing. So here in the Cyber 42 web app, right, you've already gone through all of the steps to go ahead and enter your basic auth credentials, to go ahead and register your own account, and go ahead and create your own team with you as its only member. Now, once you've done that, you will then be able to go to this Game tab here. Now, in the Game tab, you will see this. If you're accessing the app for the first time, this is just an initial action to confirm, right, so that you can see what budget, time, and starting culture you have available to you. This is just to get you familiar with the app itself. So all you're going to do is you're going to select Take Action. For every action that you take, you're going to get a confirmation box like this. Go ahead and choose Yes. And then once the selection is made, right, you will see the corresponding results confirming that you've got 40 time, 5 million budget, and a 55 culture score to start. All of your gauges, the dials at the bottom, are set to 0 by default. So go ahead and click Continue. And then now, back in the page, every once in a while you might need to refresh the browser page to make sure that you've got the latest, but you will see that, hey, you've got your current stats, but you also have the action, the next action that you can take. And this is where you are going to select an initiative, right? So go ahead and read about these different initiatives and select which one you think would be the most appropriate to choose at this moment. And once you select one of them, this Take Action button will become enabled, and you can go ahead and push Take Action to confirm your selection. Now, before I ask you to pause and go ahead and make your choice, I also do want to mention that once you make this selection, because you're playing it on demand, the game automatically advances to the next action. Now, you will see as you are progressing in the course material that you will be presented with different slides that say, hey, at this point, go ahead and do round 1, event 1, round 1, event 2, and so on. Now, the web app is going to just allow you to continue on and play the game and go through it at your own pace. However, I suggest that you don't proceed with any future events beyond the one that we talk about at that point in the slide, just so that you are aligned with doing these events at the time that they are presented in the course. So just a heads up, right? The game, as you're playing it, will present you all of these events as you are making these selections. But just go back to the slides, go back to your book, go back to the recording, and suggestion to only do the Cyber 42 events when they are presented to you in the class. So at this point, we are at round number 1, initiative selection. Go ahead and pause the recording and go to the web app and go ahead and choose one of these initiatives. All right, so just in summary, what did you just do? Well, you reviewed the 6 strategic initiatives that you have available to you that have been defined to drive larger change at Watts Warehouse. Now, just like in the real world, you were only able to choose one, right, because you can't do everything at once. But reminder, right, by the end of the class, you will be able to implement 3 total initiatives. So now that you've chosen one, you've got the opportunity as the class progresses at the appropriate time to choose 2 more initiatives.